Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's study out of the book, What Are You Afraid Of? Facing Down Fear with Faith by Dr. David Jeremiah. Today's lesson is about disapproval, the fear of rejection. And using selected scriptures today, we'll be looking in this lesson to learn how to overcome the fear of others' disapproval. In the 1930s through 1950s, Marlene Dietrich was a cinema superstar. She began acting in her native Berlin, then came to the U.S. as her fame rose. At her peak of popularity, she commanded a huge salary, and in 1999, the American Film Institute named her the 9th greatest female movie star of all time. While her life in front of the cameras was record-breaking, her life behind the scenes was heartbreaking. Dietrich spent her whole life searching for approval and adoration from others, her friends as well as her fans. When guests were invited to her home, she would play them recordings of the applause she received at her stage and film performances. No music, no dialogue, just the wild applause of her fans in cities around the world. During her one marriage, she carried on numerous affairs with movie stars and politicians, constantly seeking fulfillment. Her career ended when she fell off a stage in 1975 and broke her thigh. Addicted to alcohol and painkillers, she lived the last 11 years of her life in loneliness and seclusion in Paris. Dietrich's search for acceptance and approval was amplified by her public status. But there was nothing unique about her desire for approval and fear of rejection. Whether we recognize it or understand it, deep in the human psyche, there is the realization that we are not what we were created to be because of our separation from God. This dissatisfaction causes many to seek affirmation, often in the wrong places, as in the case of Marlene Dietrich. Teenagers as well as adults sacrifice their values and priorities as they yield to peer pressure in their search for acceptance. The Bible calls it fear of man. Our need for approval leads to the opposite, the fear of disapproval. We long for others' approval and live with the fear of their disapproval. Instead of fearing God alone, we fear people whose approval we deem to be important. But the fear of man has bad results. King Solomon sums it up pretty well in his proverb. The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe. Proverbs 29:25. In biblical times, a snare or a trap for animals became a metaphor for anything that could trap a person. Moral failure, temptation, compromise, or the fear of man. The fear of man became a snare to King Saul in 1 Samuel 15:24. The nation of Israel, Isaiah 51:12, and some followers of Jesus, John 12:42 through 43. The disciple Peter also got caught up in the snare of fearing man's disapproval when he denied knowing Jesus 3 different times. Peter so feared being persecuted by those who disapproved of Jesus that he lied about knowing him. Instead of seeking Jesus' approval, he sought the approval of Jesus' enemies. It appeared on the night Jesus was arrested. Peter and some other disciples followed those who took Jesus to the high priest's house. While in the courtyard of that house, Peter was asked 3 times if he was not one of Jesus' followers. Each time he denied it. And after the 3rd denial, a rooster crowed, just as Jesus had predicted. Matthew 26:31 through 35. And this is also paralleled in John 18:12 through 27. Peter's situation demonstrates how complex the fear of disapproval can be. At his core, Peter probably feared suffering the same fate that awaited Jesus. So he sought to gain the approval of Jesus' enemies to save his own skin. His disloyalty was rooted in the fear of man and in not having firm spiritual commitments prior to the hour of crisis. Peter found himself in self-preservation mode and did what his carnal self required to stay alive, even though he had professed to Jesus just hours earlier that he would gladly die for him. Matthew 26:33 through 35. Peter's fear was rooted in the Jewish leaders' disapproval of Jesus and his followers. He feared that their disapproval could easily result in his own arrest. So he lied and denied knowing his leader. His fear of man proved to be a tremendous snare. The crow of the rooster brought home to Peter what he had done, and he went out and wept bitterly. Matthew 26:75. Excuse me. The reality of the fear of disapproval. Peter encountered 3 different dynamics at the high priest's house. He was confronted by a servant girl, a group of peers, and an enemy, and he was afraid of them all. These encounters were all unexpected and demonstrate how important it is to have one's commitments firmly in place before the crisis arrives, as Jesus warned about in Luke 14:25 through 33. Examining Peter's 3 different encounters offers lessons in fears of disapproval. First, there's the unexpected fear. The first person who confronted Peter was a servant girl at the high priest's house, as related in John 18:17. Her question to him, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" was a total surprise in that day. A young female servant asking an accusatory question of an older man. Caught off guard, Peter merely mumbled the first thing that came to him, "I am not." Verse 17. A burly type A fisherman from Galilee had just been intimidated by a young servant girl. The fear of disapproval can be stronger than our own self-confidence and lead to a fall. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. The same can happen to us if we are not spiritually prepared. Understandable fear. Intimidation by a group is the classic example of peer pressure, and that's what Peter experienced next. Peter joined a group of servants and officers who were standing around a fire to keep warm in the high priest's courtyard. John 18:18. Let's imagine a group of maybe a dozen people discussing the night's events. Peter thought by joining and eavesdropping, he might pick up information about Jesus while remaining anonymous. But someone recognized him. "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" was the question posed in verse 25 again. Every set of eyes in the groups probably locked immediately onto Peter, waiting on him to answer. Peter lied again and denied any association with Jesus. He yielded to the understandable pressure of a group of peers. Something else probably weighing heavily upon Peter at this time was that in the garden, when they went to put hands upon Jesus, Peter drew a sword and cut the ear off of one of the servants of the high priest. Only through the miraculous intervention of Jesus was the ear restored, and Jesus' admonition to him to put away the sword. So Peter was probably doubly afraid that he might be arrested for assaulting the priest's servant. Who hasn't been caught in Peter's situation? Surely as a teenager and probably as an adult as well. We know we should speak up or stand our ground, but the fear of man, a group of peers, is too great. So we remain silent out of fear of disapproval. Peter's fear was not excusable, but for us it was understandable because we've been there. Unsurprising fear. Peter's third confrontation was the most threatening but least surprising. We can expect those who oppose us to use fear as a tactic against us, and we should be ready. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter had created an enemy. As I told you earlier, he struck a man named Malchus with a sword, severing his ear. Jesus rebuked Peter for his action and healed Malchus's ear. But the damage was done. When Peter was standing with the group in the courtyard, a relative of Malchus who had been in Gethsemane and seen Peter's sword play recognized Peter. "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" John 18:26. This man was a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Peter was now confronted by someone with an agenda to see Peter pay for his actions. But for the third time, Peter denied any association with Jesus. Verse 27. What else could he have said? He had just denied to the whole group that he didn't know Jesus. He was in too deep to change his story now. Peter had forgotten Jesus' warning that the world would hate his followers just as it hated him. John 15:18, and is also told us in 1 John 3:13. He shouldn't have been surprised to have been challenged by an enemy of Jesus, especially one who had a personal reason for seeing Peter suffer. We are to be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks us a reason for the hope that is in us, with meekness and fear. Guess who wrote that? 1 Peter 3:15. I think he learned his lesson. The reason we fear disapproval. There are 5 reasons we find ourselves in unexpected, understandable, and unsurprising situations where we fear the disapproval of others. First of all, the one that all of us have to fight, we are filled with ourselves. Probably more than any other disciple, Peter was full of himself. He once rebuked Jesus in Matthew 16:21 through 22. Jumped out of a boat to walk on water like Jesus in Matthew 14:25 through 31. Boasted he would never deny Jesus and cut off a man's ear to defend Jesus. Peter was impulsive and prideful, and it showed. Satan wanted to attack Peter and was given limited permission in order that Peter might be humbled by his failures. Luke 22, verses 31 through 32. Peter needed to learn that we are strongest when we are weakest. Paul told us this in 2 Corinthians 12:10. He needed to learn that pride is no defense against the fear of disapproval. We failed to pray. Why would people who are self-sufficient feel a need to pray? Just after Peter boasted that he would never deny his Lord, Jesus asked him to watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. Matthew 26:41. Jesus knew what lay ahead and was offering Peter a chance to gain spiritual strength. But Peter and the other disciples couldn't keep their eyes open in the garden and slept instead of praying. I wonder if Paul was thinking of Peter when he wrote, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." 1 Corinthians 10:12. Sometimes we function in the energy of flesh. Peter's sword attack on the man in the garden is evidence that Peter was functioning in his flesh, his own carnal human reasoning. He meant well, no doubt, but the arm of the flesh never accomplishes the kingdom will of God. Jesus would shortly tell Pontius Pilate that there were legions of angels at his disposal if he needed to mount a defense. Matthew 26:52 through 53. But his kingdom isn't of this world, he said, John 18:36. Paul would write later that we do not war according to the flesh. 2 Corinthians 10:3. Only one thing can happen when we depend on the flesh. We will ultimately be intimidated and defeated by someone whose flesh is stronger than ours. Another reason is we follow Jesus from far off. Paul wrote that the spirit of the flesh war against each other constantly. Galatians 5:16 and 17. Our downfall is when we want to serve both and can't. Peter followed Jesus, but at a distance. Luke 22:54. He wanted to be faithful follower of Jesus, but not follow so close that it got him in trouble. He wanted to be a disciple without paying the price. Peter wanted the approval of Jesus and the other disciples, but he didn't want the disapproval of the Jewish leaders. He was concerned about what might happen to Jesus. He just didn't want it to happen to him as well. So he followed at a distance. That's what a double-minded man does. Sometimes we find fellowship in the wrong places. Peter went from drawing a sword on these people to standing around their fire. We can give Peter the benefit of the doubt, thinking he was trying to get information about Jesus' well-being. But was that the right way to get information? Acting like he was part of their group? We should learn from what Peter's actions cost him. Don't venture into the midst of God's enemies unless you are willing to take a stand for him. So these are all the reasons. What are the resolutions to the fear of disapproval? Peter probably thought his relationship with Jesus was over after denying him 3 times. So not yet understanding what the resurrection really meant, he and some of the others of the disciples returned to Galilee to resume their vocations as fishermen. But Jesus didn't abandon them. He followed them to Galilee to resolve Peter's fear of man crisis and to restore him to ministry. Jesus' generosity towards Peter is extended to us as well. We can recover from our fear of disapproval by others to serve him faithfully. First, we need to replace our fear of others with his approval of us. When Jesus met with Peter on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in John chapter 21, his goal was to replace Peter's fear of disapproval with his own approval. He wanted to show Peter that he still accepted him even though Peter had momentarily rejected him in Jerusalem. The only thing stronger than man's disapproval is God's approval. If God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. We need to replace our fear of others with love for him. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" John 21:15-17. This time Peter answered correctly, yes. Jesus then gave Peter a new commission. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Peter needed to understand that being the bedrock of Christ's church in Matthew 16:17-19 would mean loving Jesus' followers more than he feared Jesus' enemies. We need to replace our fear of others with love for others. Before this encounter with Jesus in Galilee, Peter's life had been all about Peter. Now, in light of his new commission, Peter's life was to become all about serving others. Instead of fearing others, Peter was to focus on loving others. Fear drains us. Love empowers us. If all our energy is focused on protecting ourselves, we will have nothing with which to protect and love others. When we love others, including our enemies, life is no longer about us, and fear of disapproval is driven away. Replace our fear of others with faith in Him. Peter's new commission didn't mean he would never experience fear. To the contrary, Jesus told him he would one day stretch out his hands, be crucified, and be killed. John 21:18 through 19. And history tells us that it happened to Peter. Tell us what happened to Peter in Rome. Undoubtedly, Peter was afraid in those final hours. But it was not fear of men. It was normal human emotion that was overcome by Peter's faith in Jesus. Others are free to intimidate us, but we are free to remain faithful and not yield to the fear of disapproval. The reversal of fear of disapproval. 2 months after Peter denied Jesus in Jerusalem, no one would have recognized him as the same man. After being forgiven and commissioned by Jesus and receiving the Spirit of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, Peter became a bold and fearless preacher of the gospel in the face of the same authorities who had crucified Jesus. The only person Peter feared disappointing was Jesus himself. He had been bold in the flesh, but now he was bold in the spirit. Acts 4:13 and 5:29. If you have yielded to the fear of men, you can reverse that fear. When we fear the Lord alone, we will not fear men again. But I warn you, you have to stay in the Spirit. There were times when Peter still got it wrong, even after being empowered by Jesus in the Spirit. We have to, too, guard ourselves against being a Peter in the time of crisis instead of the person that Christ needs us to be. Fear and love the Lord and God, and nothing else can scare you. Pray that this has helped you some, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a blessed day.